Yeah, I'll react to that, sure.
Okay, it's time. Historia Civilis work. One of capitalism's most durable myths is that it has reduced human toil. One of those things that I'm super interested in, but I know enough to know that I don't know enough to know. It's like one of those opinions that I have a lot of opinions on, but I don't really have the knowledge to back it up. So it'll be, maybe I'll say some things here and there, but mainly a learning video here, all right? Just give me a shot, okay? I'll link to the original video, guys, from Historia Civilis. Top of the description, below that link to the Discord. Love to have you. My name's Connor if you're new. Preemptive like, let's learn. Juliet B. Shore, the overworked American.
We work too much. This is a pretty recent phenomenon, and so this fact makes us unusual historically. It puts us out of step with our ancestors. It puts us out of step with nature. For reasons that will become obvious, anthropologists in the 20th century became very interested in the evolution of work, and so to answer some of their questions, they looked back to Stone Age societies. What they discovered surprised them. They found that while there were unique cultural variations all over the world, virtually all Stone Age people liked to work an average of 4 to 6 hours per day. They also found that most Stone Age people liked to work in bursts, with one fast day followed by one slow day, usually something like 8 hours of work, then 2 hours of work. 8, then 2. Fast, slow. Fast, slow. These anthropologists found another thing. Pre-capitalist and pre-industrial societies all had their own ways of measuring chunks of time. Some would measure by how long it took to accomplish a specific task, or cook a specific meal, or walk a specific distance. But the odd thing is that when you compare all of these little markers that were used by different cultures, they were all somewhere in the ballpark of 30 minutes. It seems that in a world without clocks, or phones, or sundials, measuring the day in 30-minute chunks just feels good and natural to humans. Very few societies ever felt the need to break the day into smaller chunks than that. It's hard to go much deeper than that from archaeological evidence alone, but there are other pre-capitalist and pre-industrial societies that we can look back to help us. There are excellent surviving records from medieval Europe that delve into this issue, so let's start there. For virtue,
I just need coffee, guys. 1 second. I'm really interested in this, and I want to make sure I'm up and ready. Got my coffee, and I went back like 10 seconds just so I didn't miss anything. Let's go.
For virtually all of human history, most work has been agricultural work. This was also true of medieval Europe. So when thinking about medieval workers, we shouldn't be thinking about cities. We should be thinking about workers in fields. For the first hour or so of the medieval workday, people would just trickle in at their own pace. The employer was usually expected to provide some food to the workers. So for this time, people usually had a chat and a bite to eat, but otherwise did nothing. As you can imagine, convincing people to get up and start the work for the day was often quite difficult. Employers complained about it all the time. After a couple of hours in the field, there would usually be a mid-morning break that could range from 30 to 60 minutes, where workers would have another bite to eat. When the sun was high in the sky and the day was starting to get hot, work would stop again for an extended period of time, something like 2, maybe even 3 hours, depending on how hot it was that day. This period would begin with a larger midday meal that would be recognizable to us as lunch, and was followed up by, this is not a joke, nap time. In medieval Europe, siestas weren't just a Spanish thing, they were an everywhere thing. After returning to work, refreshed and rejuvenated, workers would intensify the pace of their work in an effort to finish everything up for the day. If they were done by the mid-afternoon, they could go home. If they weren't...
By the way, I love this already because I definitely feel like I naturally work that way. I have like an hour and a half of like I feel like being productive, right? And I am super productive. And if I'm forced to work for 4 hours, I'm gonna have an hour and a half of getting the bulk work done, and then 2.5 hours of whatever. So it already fits me.
They would break for another 30 to 60 minutes, with more food provided, before going back in for one last sprint. Most of the time, workers didn't have to stay much later than this, but if it was harvest season and people were working late, there would often be a larger break in the evening with a larger meal provided by the employer, but this was rare. Workers might be in the field for like 8 hours a day, but when you account for all of the breaks, they would only be working for 4 to 6 of those hours. During the busiest times of year, they might be in the fields for like 12 hours a day, but with the breaks, they would only be working for 7 to 9 of those hours. Notice the numbers we're playing with here. Stone Age peoples all over the world and agricultural workers in medieval Europe both liked to work 4 to 6 hours a day, even though each group had no knowledge or memory of each other. It seems that this is just a natural pattern that humans like. Medieval workers would work longer during the harvest or during a crisis, but they didn't like to, and that's the point. Also notice the length of these breaks. Medieval workers measured the days in 30-minute chunks, just like their Stone Age ancestors. What else sticks out in the medieval workday? Notice how the workers were constantly eating. This was one of the perks of being a day laborer. Food was a worker's biggest expense, and so part of their compensation was that their employer would take care of the food for that day. It would be like if part of your compensation was that your boss paid your rent. It relieved a massive Food was a worker's biggest expense, and so part of their compensation was that their employer would take care of the food for that day. It would be like if part of your compensation was that your boss paid your rent. It relieved a massive financial burden. One other thing to note was that work was generally understood to be a thing that happened during the day, and although there wasn't an exact science to this, a workday was broadly understood to be half of daylight hours. If there was an urgent need for people to literally work from sunrise to sunset, there was kind of a gentleman's agreement that this would count as 2 days of labor. What can we take away from all this? Work used to be a lot more informal and a lot more casual. Labor and leisure used to be intermingled. One was expected to relax and even nap on the job. Work was a part of a worker's life. Kicking back and passing the time wasn't just something workers did at home, it was equally something they did at work. Unless there was some sort of unusual crisis, workers were not expected to experience great stress while working.
So the idea of working by, getting paid by the hour is sort of, I love that, like, you have a plot of land to work, right? And you have to get the work done and do it by your own time, just have it done at the end. I love that. Maybe it's because I'm lazy or something, but I hate monotonous work hourly that, like, you can't see a finish line to. Like, you go in every day and you do the same thing and there's no end goal. It's just like, you do this. Like, you don't really get to see what your work did, And I think that if you don't like your work at all, I'm sure it won't matter that much if you see the end product or not. But if you do at all enjoy your work, I would imagine just being one one cog in this giant machine where you just have this one task, and your eyes are on that one cog at all, and you're not even looking. That's where it gets kind of depressing. No, I don't think anybody likes to work when they don't want to, of course, but I like having an end goal in mind rather than just work this many hours. I think it's more conducive to productivity, doing it the former way, and you just want someone there for 8 hours because they're supposed to be there for 8 hours, even though they only put 4 hours of work. Yeah, so, all right.
The week always began at a leisurely pace. Monday and Tuesday are described as days with a holiday spirit. Employers write of their difficulty in getting people to even show up. Thursday and Friday are described as fast days. Mondays and Tuesdays were slow, Thursdays and Fridays were fast. An echo of the Stone Age pattern of working. Fast, slow, fast, slow. Saturday was payday, and so it functioned as a hurry up and finish everything so that we can get the hell out of here day. It seems that under normal circumstances, Saturday was kind of a half day, although during busy seasons it could easily turn into another fast day, like Thursday and Friday. After the week's work was done and everybody got paid, workers got a full day off on Sunday. But by the 16th and 17th centuries, a new custom invented by workers disrupted this pattern. They called it Saint Monday. Saint Monday was kind of an unofficial holiday, where absenteeism was permitted and even expected on the first day of the work week. People were still flush with cash from last Saturday, and Monday was a slow day anyways, so it just organically became a thing that workers just didn't show up. Employers learned to tolerate it, and workers gleefully looked forward to it. Countless labor actions in early modern Europe can be traced back to some dumbass boss with something to prove, trying to crack down on their beloved Saint Monday.
Guys, one of the things that I don't think is that helpful is I think everyone has the potential to be a boss and a worker. And so, like, it almost makes it feel like these are like two separate species. Like the human was born and now he's a blue color. Whereas I think it helps the argument when we realize that everything bad and good that a worker and everything bad and good that an employer does is not specific to that person. Like we are all, I don't think we're ever going to help each other to point fingers at like it's like the argument of like when you learn about stuff in history. When I learn about stuff in history, something bad that a country did in the past, and you're like, wow, that country, what a horrible thing they did. But I think it's more helpful and conducive to fixing issues when we see that we are capable of doing that, right? Every atrocity that has been committed en masse in history, like we should see that as an example of what we are capable of doing if we aren't careful, rather than just being like, huh, wow, those people back then. Like we can say it's horrible and atrocious, and also, importantly, in my opinion, say that's what we can do. And so as much as this argument is turned into one of employer versus employee, I don't think that I think it's more helpful to see like all of us have, when we become an employee or an employer, we have a different mindset. And so I think that's important to keep in mind, that not to separate these two too much.
Something, you know, to prove, what I mean? Trying to crack down on their beloved Saint Monday. This was the real origin of the 2-day weekend. It didn't come from government. It came from workers. They just did it themselves. And it came centuries before any legislature got around to making it official. But leaving aside Saint Monday, it's striking how different the mentality of medieval workers was from the mentality of workers today. Or let's flip that around. It's striking how different our mentality is today from that of our ancestors, going back hundreds, even thousands of years. Here's one specific example of that difference. Whenever medieval workers could afford to stop working, they did. Medieval Europe was not a culture in which people saved a lot of money. This isn't because they were primitive or selfish or anything like that. There just wasn't that much for poor people to spend their money on. Food, housing, clothing, that was pretty much it. If a worker was all set in those three categories, there honestly wasn't that much else available to them. This led to a phenomenon in medieval Europe where, after all of a worker's basic needs were met, the more they earned, the less they worked. To put it another way, medieval workers liked to spend most of their discretionary income on leisure. This isn't such a strange phenomenon. If you survey people today and offer them a choice between more money and more time off, most people would take more time off.
Okay, that's something I want to.
More money and more.
1 second.
If you
I think that, and these aren't like when 95% of the stuff like I say, like I'm kind of just thinking on the moment. Like these aren't things that like I've thought of really well and like this is how I believe and I'm unchangeable. If what I'm saying right now, which is very much just I'm thinking, is wrong, please let me know. Please, I am not entrenched in any of my beliefs here, okay? But why do people save money today, right? Compared to back then? Well, imagine if you didn't have a very good way to handle your money, you don't have the economic structures around your money that gives security enough to lessen the risk of even saving your money. Who knows how, inflation is going to work, how much your money is going to be worth. Where can you put your money to even save it up, right? I'm sure fires are pretty common, and the fact that there isn't that much social mobility at all. Not to say that there is an enormous amount today, but I'm sure in certain places more than others, more so than here. And so if you know, like your parent worked in the field, their parent worked in the field, there isn't a great way to secure your money and gain it over time, then why save it up? You know what I mean? And so I'm sure if people in this time period had all of the structures around today to secure your money, to put it away, to save it, I'm sure they would have done it a bit more. And I'm sure if we didn't have what we have today and it was much more uncertain and there wasn't that much mobility anyway, if you saved up a lot, well, what is the point of even spending? And so that's just kind of, I'm sure that played a role as well.
On leisure. This isn't such a strange phenomenon. If you survey people today and offer them a choice between more money and more time off, most people would take more time off. It's just that under our system, people are never offered that choice. Or when they try to exercise that choice for themselves, they are either professionally punished or fired. In medieval Europe, people could make that choice for themselves, and whenever possible, workers worked less, a lot less. There were 3 major holiday periods where workers routinely took a big chunk of time off: Easter, Midsummer, and Christmas. Or for the uninitiated, March or April, late June, and late December.
It's summer.
I would note that of the 3, only the December holiday period made it into the modern era intact. Things really slowed down in the winter. Days were short, and the work was short. Because of this, a tradition evolved called winter wages, where workers were paid half a day's wage for half a day's work. We're talking about a 4-hour workday at the very most. If you add in all the breaks, this would be maybe 2 to 3 hours of actual work. Winter wages were usually done for the months of December and January, and during this time, people took as much time off as they could afford. Workers spent their extra time on indoor labor that might not generate a profit. Home repairs, building new furniture, patching up or making new clothing. These were jobs best saved for the slow winter months. When you total up the estimated number of days worked by medieval farm laborers, things become quite stark. Researchers have found that Spanish farm laborers did not work for 42% of days in a year. In France, the number was more like 49%. The English usually worked more, but this wasn't because they were naturally more industrious. It's because they were historically more exploited by their aristocracy. When there was a labor shortage in the 14th century, English laborers immediately used their clout to create more time off for themselves. For a time, English workers enjoyed 51% of days free from work. The funny thing about these numbers, 42%, 49%, 51%, is that once again, they echo how people worked in Stone Age societies. Almost every other day off. Fast, slow, fast, slow.
Question. I think a lot of us getting away from the what he calls the Stone Age fast slow cycle is that a lot of tasks that had to be done in medieval and Stone Age times you couldn't do. Nowadays when you're at a computer and you're an accountant or something, there's no area of the year that is necessarily going to be slow compared to the other ones. I think coupled with a little bit more, like, you're not destined. I don't want to come across when I say like you're not destined to be in the same profession as your father and your grandfather, and you will be that your whole life no matter what you do. But it was certainly, I believe, more of a thing the further you go back in time. I'm sure with a little bit inconsistency, but as a whole, I think that's fair to say, right? So without saying that there is perfect social and economic mobility today, of course it's not perfect, but I think that's fair to say that it was almost non-existent back then. Almost. I'm sure there are a few cases. And so I think that coupled with less mobility and less needing to change, or less possibility, meaning less time spent on trying to build wealth, less security in holding the wealth, and the fact that back then, of course, you had these longer and shorter days depending on the time of the year because of the productivity of the farmland needing more work, and so that's just what I had to say there. I probably reiterated stuff I didn't need to.
Slow, fast, slow. Labor historian E.P. Thompson describes this work pattern as a natural human rhythm and a common preference in people across different regions, different cultures, and different times. For a point of comparison, consider a modern worker working 5 days a week. In a calendar year, that worker has 28% of days off. Add in the 10 or so public holidays that most countries have, and that worker now has 31% of days off. Add in 2 weeks of vacation, and that worker now has 34% of days off. Assume instead that they get 6 weeks of vacation, and that worker has 39% of days off. In order for a modern worker to even begin to rival the amount of time off enjoyed by a medieval French farm laborer, that modern worker would need to be provided with 3.5 months of vacation per year, plus weekends, plus public holidays. Medieval workers were operating on a level so far beyond us that it's difficult to even dream that big.
Again, the competition aspect too. If you can work, I'm sure if the farm. By the way, this is not. I don't think really he's had any. He's been describing things that I certainly agree with so far, but nowadays it's competition. If you go and say, all right, I don't want to work that much, well, there's going to be someone else who wants to take your job and then just gonna be like, hey, I'll work for that much, right? And that's a lot of what unions are for, right? Is that so somebody can't just fire a bunch of people off and then just boom, just replace, easy replace right there. And well, it's not to say that you couldn't do that back then. So I don't know. I'm just okay.
Up until the modern era, workers were paid by the day. The length of the workday could fluctuate throughout the year, but even during the busiest periods, workers might be in the fields for 12 hours at most. But as I've said, if you take into account all of the breaks and meal times and nap times, that might translate into 8 hours of actual work. And that was on the busy end of the spectrum. At other times, a shortened workday would often lead to less than 4 hours of actual work. That all began to change with the proliferation of mechanical clocks. Cities and towns began building clock towers in their town squares in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. And before too long, churches and, yes, even some private businesses were inspired to have mechanical clocks of their own. Arguably, the most important clock ever built was installed at the Amsterdam Stock Exchange in 1611. The Netherlands were at the epicenter of this new capitalism fad that was sweeping Europe, and their shiny new stock exchange reflected that. Local Dutch governments tried to curb the capitalist fervor taking over their country by restricting stock trading to certain times of day, 2 hours in the summer and 30 minutes in the winter. Wait a second, see that? Even as late as 1611, Dutch stock traders had their own version of winter wages. It didn't even necessarily make sense for their job. It was just in the culture that that's what people did in the winter. Anyways, the Dutch wanted to issue hefty fines to any traders who violated these restrictions. So the stock exchange,
Hold on. I think that's a good point right there.
people did in the winter. Sense for their job. It was just in the culture.
So I think maybe the change in work ethic is only going to, like, employees will only be forced, the change in the work ethic of employees rather than the employer, right, is going to, if everyone has the assumption that, like, of course you get winter break, let me like put it this time, you get Christmas break, obviously, you get, say, like a month off in summer, that's just like what we're used to doing. You get like 2 weeks off in Easter, you get a week off for Thanksgiving and 4th of July, and everyone is used to that and accepts that. Well, then there isn't going to be the issue of, well, if I don't do this, someone else will, because everyone has that that notion in their mind already. But if the culture can be trimmed down to accepting less and less and less vacations, then it's basically an employer's greatest friend is the lowering of cultural expectations of resting. So, because if you can lower the expectations of resting in the working population, then the moment someone says, like, what do you mean I can't have this time off? Well, you're going to find way more people that are like, yeah, I'll work then, right? So I guess if you want to, that's the thing. It's like the employer cannot exploit the employee nearly as much if the employees are on the same page. If they aren't, that's the employer's best friend, right? That is gold, right? Because, all right, leave. Hey, you want a job? Sure, let's go right here. I'll work for half. Like, give me the job. Me. And it's almost like, in order for the herd to survive, they all need to stay in there. At the moment people start to go up to the employee and be like, hey, I'll work, right? I don't need that. That's when the whole thing crumbles. And that's really interesting, which I only really thought about from what he said there.
That's what people did in the winter. Anyways, the Dutch wanted to issue hefty fines to any traders who violated these restrictions. So the stock exchange commissioned a giant state-of-the-art clock. This idea quickly proliferated to every stock exchange in Europe. And with this, the clock escaped the public realm of town squares and entered the private realm of business. All of a sudden, capitalism...
I'm thinking instead of watching. Let me go back like 20 seconds. Let me just sum it up, okay? From what I just thought about, is that cultural expectation of rest will lead to greater work conditions, and the less expectation of rest that is just built into the mentality and the culture. I plan on making it more simple in it. So yeah, that's what I mean. Like, look at a place like Spain or a place like Tokyo or a place like Japan, where, a place like Japan, there isn't a lot of culture surrounding rest. In Spain, there seems to be, siesta mentality. And so there are way more easily exploitable workers in Japan than a place like Spain. And the more that the earth becomes a kind of global place, I think even better for the employer. Because, am I going too far here? Because if the employer can now take workers from a 7 billion population people who all have different cultural expectations of work, then you can find the lowest denominator of expectation of work or expectation of rest and have those employees. And I feel like I'm going too far here.
This idea quickly proliferated to every stock exchange in Europe. And with this, the clock escaped the public realm of town squares and entered the private realm of business. All of a sudden, capitalists wanted to prove how much of a capitalist they were by having their place of business install a mechanical clock, just like their local stock exchange. Clock mania had begun. Textile mills were the first businesses utterly transformed by the clock. Some brain genius had the idea to connect the mechanical clock to a bell, which would signal the beginning and the end of the workday. This was a profound cultural shift, and workers really struggled to make sense of it. Understandably, under the old system, and by the old system I mean the way that people have been working for all of human history, workers were hired by the day and measured the day in 30-minute chunks. They began and ended their workday accordingly within a broad 30-minute window. Now, workers were hired by the hour and measured the day in 60-second chunks. This was new, and it was confusing. Many workers responded to the workday bell by doing the most logical thing under the circumstances. They just ignored it. It had never mattered before at precisely what minute one began or ended their work, so why should it matter now? But the capitalists cared. In fact, they would develop an unhealthy obsession with the clock. Before too long, the capitalists were able to convince city governments to get involved, who began issuing fines to workers who were late for the workday bell. Let me say this again. If a worker who worked for a private business was 1 minute late for work, the local government would fine them as much as an entire day's pay. This kind of thing had never been done before.
Can't this only happen if they're So take this and take it back to the beginning example of the farm, right? And, this is the head of the farm. These are the farm laborers. And I guess this is like the town council or whatever. I feel like, so why aren't these people saying no? Is it because of they know that they'll just be fired and replaced? But if they're going to be fired and replaced, yeah, it seems like putting people into a large factory and muddling them or muffling them, whatever, muzzling them. It can only work if, again, there are other workers who are willing to go on. And if they see how you were treated, I don't know.
It had never been part of the unwritten contract between bosses and workers. The capitalists just invented this new rule out of whole cloth, and they did it by joining hands with local governments across Europe. Industrial capitalism and the heavy hand of government, friends since the very beginning. The owners of the textile mills wanted to change the culture of work, and they did, but they did it by basically beating their workers into submission.
assuming this is how unions arise, right? But
As capitalism and later industrialization swept across Europe, it brought with it an oppressive, even authoritarian relationship between workers and owners. Shortly after the introduction of the clock, the capitalist class killed the customary afternoon nap that had been part of the workday for as long as people could remember. Absolutely tragic. They also stopped providing food to the workers, which dumped an extra financial burden onto the working class. Mealtimes, which up until now had been long and informal and subsidized by the employer, were shortened and regulated down to the minute.
question, guys, what made it about factories that allowed the owner, the boss, employer to cut these things that the employer at a farm who needed laborers, like, why didn't the farm owners do this? Why didn't they say, all right, no afternoon nap, no free meals, no long breaks? What changed when it transferred instead of a farm to a factory? Like, why is it like now, okay, now, all right, I'm getting rid of all this stuff?
The entire workday was just squeezed and squeezed until all of the air and all of the culture and all of the joy was taken out of it. But soon, even having a maximally productive workday wasn't enough. Workers quickly figured out that they could not trust the company clock. Many bosses liked to fiddle with the time so that the workday started a little bit too early and ended a little bit too late. One trick that bosses liked to pull with early company clocks was to rig them to the production line so that if there was any sort of technological problem, as there often was, then the clock would stop. Later generations of company clocks had mechanisms built into them that caused them to periodically pause during the workday, accumulating minutes, only to suddenly jump forward to the real time during breaks. It's funny, because the capitalists were the ones that invented this idea that the clock must reign supreme. They were the ones who had the government fine people if they were 1 minute late for work. They were the ones who unilaterally imposed this new social contract on workers, and then they were the ones to immediately break this new social contract.
Please, this is my question. What made the factory owner different from the farm owner? Like, are you acting that because they're inside, they won't notice that when they go outside and they leave, they're very noticeable of the sun and how it, right? They're not going to be like, wait, what? This is bull crap. Like, I'm sure they're going to trust themselves for what they've been doing for generations and judging the time of day more so than this new clock invention. So, that's my question. I'm like, why did it start at the factory? Like, was the factory worker somehow... Was the factory employer somehow more ruthless than the farm employer? Was it because factories didn't rely on some stuff that farms did, that you couldn't work as much? Factory, a day in July could be just as productive as a day in December. And so, like, what is it? I feel like I'm missing something here. What changed? I refuse to believe that a factory owner is somehow... like has this evil gene that a farm owner doesn't have. That's where I'm trying to, like, how are people able to get away with this that they couldn't?
Why? No reason, really, just for a few extra bucks. Like I said, workers caught on pretty quickly, but when workers talked with other workers about how the company clock was inaccurate, it became standard practice within the textile industry to fire them on the spot. Fast forward 200 years. When pocket watches became common, workers did the sensible thing and brought them to work. Why wouldn't they? The capitalists had established long ago that being even 1 minute late for work was a mortal sin. Surely pocket watches would enable workers to be supernaturally punctual. This was exactly what the bosses wanted, right? But that's not how it went. For the first time ever, workers with pocket watches had physical proof that their bosses were tampering with the clocks. This practice was so egregious and so morally wrong that it became a political scandal, particularly in Britain, with genuine calls for regulation and reform. The capitalists responded to this scandal by...
Let me guess.
Well, what do you think they did? Imagine, you own a factory, you find out your middle managers are messing with the company clock. Word gets out, there are angry newspaper columns, there are debates in parliament, there's the threat of legislation coming down on your head, there is a full-blown political scandal. What do?
Alright, we're good.
If you said, ban pocket watches from factories, search workers before they enter the building, and fire anybody who complains about it, then congratulations, you're a fascist.
Oh.
And yeah, that's exactly what the capitalists did.
I was excited.
By now, it should be clear that the mechanical clock was a tool used by the industrialists to subjugate and exploit their workers. It was never about productivity or efficiency, because they proved over hundreds of years that they would rather fire a productive worker than run an accurate company clock. That was where their priorities were. It was never really about profits, was it? It was about power. 20th century Canadian socialist George Woodcock, who wrote at length about what he called the tyranny of the clock, wrote the following. And because, without some means of exact timekeeping, industrial capitalism could never have developed and could not continue to exploit their workers, the clock represents an element of mechanical tyranny in the lives of modern men, more potent than any other exploiter or any other machine. All of the trends that began with the mechanical clock kicked into overdrive with the widespread adoption of artificial lighting. This is what finally killed winter wages. Now, there was no need to take it easy when the days were short. With artificial lighting, capitalists started treating every season like it was harvest season. That's how factory workers got stuck working 12, 14, 16-hour shifts, not just during the busy season, but all year long. That familiar feeling where you leave work in the winter and it's already dark out? That wasn't a thing until like 1802. That was a thing that was invented by industrial capitalists in order to maximize productivity.
There's one thing with that I want to... Is that... Don't you think that... I want to point out a possible flaw in that logic without sounding like I'm trying to come to the defense of this kind of attitude. Obviously not. But the winter hours were winter hours because you could not work. What was there to work in the winter on the fields, you know? And I'm sure if there were... Like, I'm of the belief that none of these thought processes are anything new. Like, the wanting to exploit workers, all of this stuff is not new. This is, I'm sure, been around for as long as society's been around. But you know, people are often really selfish and often don't put themselves in other people's shoes, and even if they do, so it's stuff like that that I'm like, wait, that kind of takes my attention away from the full point of the video, and that somehow the tyrannical evil boss was invented with factories. That's the part where I'm just not on board with yet. Like, or the idea of production was and people being exploited wasn't a thing. Clearly, on this industrial kind of dystopian way, obviously, right? Like, I don't think there's any, like, there's no wonder Karl Marx wrote Das Kapital when he was alive. That is when seemingly work conditions were at their worst in this industrial age, right? So, yeah, it's stuff like that where I don't want to approach points like that where I'm like, yeah, but wait, when I should just be focused on the point of the video. So
The industrial capitalists did not stop with the tyranny of the mechanical clock, and they did not stop with the 12, 14, or even 16-hour workday. In time, they expanded their reign of terror to target public holidays. Within a matter of decades, public holidays that had existed for hundreds of years were systematically suppressed in favor of more work. We talked earlier about the late medieval period, when workers were able to live lives where they had 42%, 49%, 51% of days off. Only 200 or 300 years later, workers had to learn to survive with only 15% of days off. The industrial capitalists would have taken more if they could, but the church mounted a defense of Sunday as a day off, mostly. At the end of it all, the lives of workers had been completely transformed. English workers in the 19th century were working 80% more than English workers in the 17th century. The country had never been richer, but you would never know it by looking at the workers. Over the century leading up to this, the British GDP had grown by 50%, but over the same period, worker pay was not just stagnant, but in decline. They were doing almost double the work for less pay. And the transformation wasn't just in the number of hours worked. Owners and bosses used their leverage to force their workers to live in a tiny authoritarian world run by capitalists. This shift in the culture of work has always been fascinating to me, and so I tried to look back to where it first began. When and why did we shift from the more casual and laid-back work culture that came out of medieval Europe to the more totalizing and authoritarian and inhuman work culture that came out of the Industrial Revolution? I think I've figured out where things started to shift, and I think I've got it pinned down to the exact year: 1664. In 1664, some absolutely psychotic capitalist named Richard Palmer, cursed be his name, paid the church in the town of Wokingham, England, to ring their bell at precisely 4 o'clock every morning and at precisely 8 o'clock every evening. He did this because he was still seeing the cultural evidence of winter wages, where workers woke up later during the slow winter months and worked half as hard as they normally did. As a capitalist, this drove Palmer crazy. He felt that it was deeply important for workers to be up 4 hours before sunrise every day, even if they didn't really have any work to do. If they didn't want to wake up on their own, he would do it for them. So he had the church bell ring at 4 o'clock every morning, 4 hours before sunrise. He also felt that it was his job to tell people when to go to bed, so he had the church bell ring at 8 o'clock every evening. Also, shout out to this church for straight up abandoning their religious mission and surrendering to this capitalist weirdo. Way to go, guys. I hope the money was worth it. According to Richard Palmer and this new breed of 17th century capitalist coming up with him, private time was an outdated concept. This new generation of capitalists wanted a say in how workers were spending their hours at home. They even wanted a say in what time they went to bed. They had a totalitarian worldview. As far as they were concerned, all time was company time. Inspired by the work of Richard Palmer, this particular form of abuse became a fashionable trend in England. Psychopaths all across the country started co-opting churches and victimizing towns, all in the name of productivity. 20th century Canadians—
I had a point that didn't make any sense.
all in the name of productivity. 20th century Canadian socialist George Woodcock writes of this new breed of capitalist. The new capitalists, in particular, became rabidly time-conscious. Time, here symbolizing the labor of workers, was regarded by them almost as if it were the chief raw material of industry. But this newfound obsession with time and productivity didn't stop there. When this new generation of capitalists left their places of business, they would see their workers getting off work for the day. And what did they see them doing? Standing around in groups, chatting, relaxing on public benches, walking into public houses to grab a meal, or God help us, a drink. All of this public recreation bothered Palmer and his friends immensely. Palmer's obsession with the clock coincided almost exactly with the rise of English newspapers. And what did this first generation of newspapers like to discuss? They liked to discuss the problem of the poor, and specifically the problem of the leisure activities of the poor. The capitalists were very open about this. They said that the only legitimate leisure activities for the poor were mental cultivation or religious study. Basically, studying Latin or studying the Bible. That's what poor people should be allowed to do for fun. Anything other than that, they argued, was corrosive to the culture. For those keeping track at home, bribing the church and turning it into a private tool for the capitalists.
It's so weird when the snowball gets rolling long enough to where, like, now people are seen as employers and employees rather than people living in a society, right? And now it's like it's been something for so long that the employer kind of class, and I'm sure their children will be wealthy too and everything, are now seeing the worker as like cattle. And it's like, oh, dang, what are the cattle doing? They're just laying around. Well, get them up. They need exercise so they can make better meat and more high-quality milk. It's not good for them. It's not good for society. And this is the part where it's like, like, it's getting to the, not quite the slave-master mentality, but it's getting there, for sure.
Bribing the church and turning it into a private tool for the capitalist class, not corrosive to the culture. Relaxing on a public bench after work, corrosive to the culture. These people were demons. That's what the capitalists wanted. No life outside of work. No hobbies. No idleness. No relaxation. No days off. Nothing to look forward to. No life. Just work and someone else's profit. 20th century Canadian socialist George Woodcock concedes that mechanical time is valuable as a means of coordination of activities in a highly developed society, just as the machine is valuable as a means of reducing unnecessary labor. But, he argued, the modern use of the mechanical clock labor. But, he argued, the modern use of the mechanical clock did not reduce unnecessary labor. It did the opposite. Hurried meals, the regular morning and evening scramble for trains or buses, the strain of having to work to time schedules, all contribute to digestive and nervous disorders.
I agree, of course, but I think the clock is being used as a sort of, not a red herring, as a, it's like, I think the clock, all of this stuff, I think placing it on the clock, not that they're being exactly literal, but closer to literal than, it's like, in my opinion, it's cultural acceptance of less rest time, along with competition, knowing, you know, humans are competitive, wanting to beat out the other person, and knowing that all of these stuff people are going to do and you're going to be left behind, and that causes all of these disorders. I think saying the mechanical clock, although you might not mean it as quite literal, it's the clock that made all these issues. It's kind of coming across that way a little bit.
To ruin health and shorten life.
Like my great worry with this, all of this completely true, obviously, and it's not as bad today as it was in the 1800s. It's easy. I feel like I'm gonna get it. All right, is that why is it that people do this? what can be done to stop people from doing this, and how do we know that we won't have the same exact issues in a giant. So I think that a lot of this needs to be put on how people think, how people act when they're in charge. Like the what's that experiment? Like I think it was done in San Francisco. Like you I forget where it was. Like where like college students, some were made the police officer and some were made the inmates, and how people just took on that idea of like I am not about like, oh, employers evil, right? Landlords evil, trash, kill them. Like not like I like to see like there are people that like look at the psychological aspect of it, because just pointing fingers is not going to fix the problem. All it's going to do is perhaps get rid of those people and have people who used to be workers take those positions and then do the same exact thing. I don't want to do that. I hate the idea of a great argument and good points, but in the end, not addressing the problem of humans doing this and kind of separating it more between employers bad, employees good, and oh, back in 500 years ago, employees were they were great, right? And it seems all a lot more nefarious in argument than it is logical in argument, and how there's no surprise that people act this way. And it seems like it's being portrayed that, yeah, I think we need to look at the exploitation of people against other people rather than the exploitation of just buzzwords of like workers versus, right? And because I think that does a disservice, and that's just immediate emotional reaction that could end up in not as much change compared to being more realistic and letting down emotions a bit and saying, all right, this is what people do, and maybe, you know, the system has to be more regulated and society's mindset has to be changed a bit, and expectations of how much time we get off work needs to be pretty similar in all of us, because if it's not similar, then other people are going to go right into the job that you left because you weren't happy, and then nothing changes. And so I think a lot of people watching this video are going to be angry, like, classic capitalism, worker or employers, and it's like, well, why are they doing this? Like you said, it's because of power, not money. Well, that's something that I'm sure every human is very susceptible to, right? And I think that's important, and a little more emphasis, I think, needs to be put on that. But otherwise, really, really great video. Please tell me if I'm wrong, guys.
I'm
thinking words.
We are richer as a society than ever before, but somehow we are less free. Workers have lost so much, not just our afternoon naps and our holidays, but our autonomy, our dignity. In short, we work too much. But it doesn't have to be this way. Medieval French peasants took as much time off as they could afford, which for them was 49% of the year. It's time for us to start moving back in that direction. We already know how to do this. We have the money. We have the policies. We have the administrative capacity. We have everything we need to work less.
Like, you don't think that the person in medieval France who was in charge of the workers that got 49% off didn't value power? Like he said before, it's not about money, it's about power. You don't think they had the same urge of power of controlling people? But no, the expectation was different. The employers back in medieval France, or whatever you want to call them, in charge, if they saw, you know, if they had a means of making money that workers could do it all year, and they had a sufficient population to kick people out if they weren't working on time like they wanted to and bring people in, they would have done it. Surely they would have done it. But when the Industrial Revolution came around and factories and this setting where people were just doing repetitive work on, and there was a large population of people to hire if they don't like someone, and that puts pressure on the person working there, knowing that they can be replaced and that then they can't ask for as much. And when everyone can't ask for as much, then that societal expectation of rest lowers. And then rinse, repeat, on and on. And who cares if everything, if the country is way richer and we have so many cool modern gadgets because of capitalism, if your day-to-day life is still miserable. Okay? So absolutely great. I love that part of this, but at the other time, I think a lot of people talking about this stuff act like human greed and ruthlessness started with capitalism. Capitalism and the way that businesses began to grow definitely gave a good tool for people who are power hungry to subjugate people. Absolutely. But I think we're doing a disservice to ourselves when trying to learn and overcome this by pointing fingers at people rather than overall attitude and society's perception and expectation of how much time they should get off. So, like he's saying here, the only way to move this number back up to this number is not to like down with capitalism, down. It's moving the, don't throw the baby with the bathwater, is moving society's agreement on a reasonable level of rest. And then the employer, they have no power anymore. If you take away their ability to filter people out they don't want and take in new workers, that strips their main power. Okay? So again, I agree that we've kind of accepted more and more or less and less time off, and then that just compounds the issue and you're more afraid of working and everything, and the boot on your neck gets tighter and tighter. Well, a great solution to that would be to a great solution. Like, I know it. I'm just saying, like, changing everyone's expectation and being together is the best way to counteract this, rather than some like
the only
like revolutionary level ending of modern capitalism, in my opinion.
thing we lack is the ambition.
Really great video. I think my last comment was pretty good in what I wanted to say, and that's the main thing. So I don't really feel like I have to do an outro. In that, so my takeaway from the video, I agree with a lot of things. Where I disagree, or at least I think more emphasis needs to be put on, is that people aren't born as either an employee or an employer with this mindset. Everyone, I think, is relatively equally susceptible to power hungriness and wanting to put down others. And it'll only, looking at this and looking at the kryptonite of this, which is, in my opinion, societal expectation of rest, is the kryptonite to employers getting all of the, squeezing every ounce of work out of an individual they can. So I think that's the kryptonite, is societal cohesiveness and agreement in a reasonable amount of rest when working. Once you agree on that, then they can't fire you because everyone else will have the same expectation. So shedding light, like, we have more means of communication now than ever. Shedding light on the injustices put on workers in a factory setting, because if an employee can hear you're saying something that's kind of reasonable, like, hey, look at the clock, it's not going, or hey, this is unreasonable. The best thing is to get rid of you quick, have no one bat an eye, and have someone else come in. That is the greatest tool for any employer, which, again, don't think you're above it or I'm above it. I've never been an employer, so I don't know it. But I don't want to say, like, oh, I'd never do that. I have no idea. I've never been in that situation. So, yeah, shedding light on the mistreatment of workers, having workers talk with each other. You don't even have to, have unions and whatnot, is the greatest kryptonite to this issue. And yeah, so very interesting video. Hope you guys are doing well. Would appreciate any comments. I definitely said a lot of things that on a subject I'm not very well versed on. It just kind of using my own thoughts here, and I would appreciate any rebuttals, responses, comments at all. Hope you guys are doing well, and I'll see you next video. Bye, guys.